This is the European History Lecture for Tuesday, the 6th of April, 2021. Wilson has set up a system of national self-determination, advocating mightily for this within the Paris Peace Conference, which is going to produce the League of Nations. This idea is his solution to the problem of European wars. Wilson believes, like a good rationalist, that you can figure out any problem and, if you are smart enough, come up with a solution. Even if that solution has no rooting in history, if it's theoretically sound, it must have validity. Well, this is a point of view which is very much in keeping with the profession of being a theorist par excellence, aka a college professor. But as much as college professors don't like to admit it, an economics professor does not understand business the way a businessman does. A political science professor does not understand politics the way a professional politician does. And a history professor doesn't understand war the way a soldier does. Theory has its place, but some humility to those who work in the field and to the history which produces the world we live in would go a long way to leavening some of the harsher theoretical judgments that have caused a lot of misery in the world. Just because something is theoretically sound doesn't make it actually valid. This is the conceit of knowledge, the pretense of knowledge, that all educators, no doubt including myself, are subject to. The idea if we can intellectualize something or model something in our minds, that we therefore understand it, perhaps understand it in a way superior to those who actually work with it for a living, who don't necessarily have the theoretical training that we do. Wilson, unfortunately, is particularly prone to this vanity. The vanity that he is the smartest man in any room he happens to be in. And that vanity is going to cost the world. He's trying his best to make a world that's better. But his concept of better is just one man's vision. It isn't necessarily intrinsically or objectively better. But he thinks it is, because he's so intelligent. His concept of dealing with the problems that are caused by having so many microstates who are weaker intrinsically than the Russians or the Germans or the Ottomans or any other great power is a new idea in human history, the League of Nations. Logically, theoretically, it makes total sense. Shouldn't there be a place in the world where nations can come together to work out their differences peacefully? I mean, this idea of transnational organizations predates World War I. A group of well-intentioned nabobs in The Hague, Holland, or the Netherlands if you prefer, decided to arrogate unto themselves the title of the World Court. Did anyone vote to establish a world court in any country on earth? No. These jurists decided the world needed a court. Why not them? And since then, I think it was 1906 when they started, people who wanted to make press would bring cases to the International Court at The Hague, and notions of war crime and war criminals and violations of international law are adjudicated there. But at no point did the nations of the world or the people of the world establish such a thing. It established itself because people thought it would be a good idea. Now, I will say that the League of Nations and its successor, the United Nations, and I laugh because it is demonstrably the most corrupt organization in human history, The Iraq oil for food scandal is something you should look into if you're ever interested in international political corruption. It went on for about a decade, and it was amazingly scammy in terms of getting money into the hands of key bureaucrats and politicians. Not so good at preventing the Iraqis from building up another military, which is what it was supposed to do. But the idea of international law and international standards works very well if you want to buy into it. So Wilson, piggybacking on the idea of an international court, proposes a League of Nations that will be an international forum for governments to come and ask for arbitration, which is what happens when people have a fight and they go to a third party to get it solved. If you've ever had a fight with a sibling or a fight with a friend, and you both just can't resolve it, but you both are involved or relating to somebody who you each deeply respect, you bring the problem to them and you ask them to help solve it. That's arbitration. And that is something that people do. It's a smart idea sometimes. So the League of Nations is going to be available as an arbitration body for countries who have difficulties with one another. And there'll be a bureaucracy to monitor things like human rights. Its very existence will encourage the growth of this concept called international law, because the League of Nations will deal in international law. The League of Nations is going to be built in harmony with the International Court at The Hague. All of this makes sense if you assume that the goal of national policy is to solve problems peacefully. It's like a cat leash. I don't know if you have cats in your home or how familiar you are with felines, but dogs work well with leashes. Cheetahs, oddly enough, work reasonably well with leashes if you know what you're doing. Cats don't. With the exception of cheetahs, which are the most dog-like of felines, cats don't. You put a leash on a cat and see what happens. Unless it's a very unusual cat that you train from a very young age, it'll probably drop in its tracks and invite you to drag it around. It's not going to cooperate. It's not going to go along with you. It doesn't want to wear this thing, and it's not going to walk nicely by your heel.
My brother's cat, his name is Sven.
Sped?
Sven.
Sven, okay.
Sven Thorvald.
Just a little Norwegian there,
yeah,
okay.
Just a little, yeah. Right. He's the most dog-like cat ever. Like, it's really funny, because most cats, like, are really kind of sensitive to most movements.
Yep.
Like, you can scream at him, and he just sits there. And, like, we put our foot on him, like, when he was, like, sitting down. Like, we were standing up, and we just put our foot on him. And he just looks up, and he's like, what are you gonna do, step on me? Like, he doesn't care. And then, like, my brother took him for a walk one time. It's very weird, because he's a doofus. And he'll just, like, run away from nothing, and then slam headfirst into a chair. And
is he a Norwegian forest cat?
No, he's
or
not.
A Maine Coon cat?
No, he's a, Flame Point Siamese, but he's blonde hair, blue eyes. So.
Oh wow! Siamese are eccentric anyway.
Yeah.
And I've never seen a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Siamese.
Well, he's Flame Point, so it's like ginger and white, and then bright blue eyes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
My
brother will probably tell you about it if he has a chance.
Definitely. Well, I may ask him about it later today. That's good. A cat leash is one of the best toys to have with a kitten is magician string. Magician string is very soft. It looks like rope, but it's hollow. And it's what magicians use to do knot tricks, to move knots around and things like that. We used to live next door to the wife of the Baskin-Robbins clown. And so she gave us this stuff. It was fun. She was a nice lady. We got her a cat. So you're dangling this rope, and most kids, cats, depends on their personality, but most kittens are like, get that string, and they'll grab the string, and they'll muckle down on it. And that's when you have a cat leash. You can lead them around, they'll follow you, they're holding on to the string. However, the moment something else gets their attention, they let go of the string and they go off. So a cat leash, in my parlance, is when a cat is letting you lead them around because they're biting onto the string that you're holding. When they stop biting onto the string, they're done.
1 year after my birthday, I had balloons that, like a really big balloon that had a string on it, and my cat bit onto it and would just carry it around the house. So I would just be walking around and I'd see just this massive balloon floating and my cat was pulling it.
That's delightful. I've seen that too. Have you ever seen a cat pull the balloon down from the ceiling and then pop it?
No.
Okay. We had a cat that did that once. But no, I've seen that. That is funny. What's also funny is if you get two of them together and they're both doing it at the same time, the balloons bounce around and they don't know it. International politics can be peaceful if both parties are interested in peace. However, the world is not led by college professors or priests or saints. Oftentimes, one of the horrible things for anyone to realize is just how many nations in the world are run by murderous criminals. Because most of them are. In most societies, the most aggressive, violent, brutal people take power. The Communist Party of China is not led by the smartest, nicest, most efficient people ever. They're led by the most brutal and vicious people in the party. People who successfully backstab dozens of people to get to the top. Most sub-Saharan African nations are led by genuine thugs. It's horrible if you look at the kind of people that run the world. They're not the best and the brightest. They're not the nicest and the most humane. What that means is that oftentimes when there's a national problem or an international problem, there isn't any interest in working it out peacefully. There's an interest in either achieving victory of some kind at the expense of your neighbors or of having the kind of defeat internationally that will boost your power domestically by making your people more resentful of the outside world and supportive of you. When both parties want peace, an organization like the League of Nations can make that peace more easy to achieve. But when a party is not interested in peace, no amount of international law, international arbitrations, League of Nations, United Nations, or anything else is going to stop it. People are going to do what people are going to do. And if you have a nation led by a guy who has killed his way to the top, it makes total sense that he will continue to try to kill his way towards international success. Still, it's a new idea, and the idea is that the League of Nations, I can't believe I didn't write this down, it's kind of an important term. The League of Nations is going to produce what is called collective security. You will want to write that down. Security. Collective security. In other words, Wilson's presumption is that if you join the League of Nations, you will accept as an a priori assumption the idea that we are all in it to stop aggression. The League of Nations will be a debating society, yes. But it will also keep the peace because we all in the League of Nations will try to stop by any means necessary aggression, which causes war. We will try to stop invasions. We will try to stop conquests. We will try to stop all sorts of problems by giving a place to talk and by setting up economic sanctions and political boycotts and even police actions or wars to stop wars. We are going to be in this together. So an aggressor nation doesn't just have to calculate the potential enemy's forces. An aggressor nation will also have to calculate, will the League of Nations get involved? Will the League of Nations send naval forces and troops from its member nations to come stop us from taking what we want to take? And if the League of Nations demonstrates an ability to do that, the League of Nations can function as a world police. Instead of having the British Empire function as the world's policeman, we'll have an international body do it. And that's more palatable on a theoretical level to a lot of people. So Wilson proposes the League of Nations as the solution to the power vacuum created in Central Eastern Europe by turning 3 major empires into a bunch of microstates, flanked by 2 resentful empires that have lost a lot of land, Germany and Russia. However, I told you that Wilson was an arrogant fellow, a vain fellow, intellectually proud. I'm not just saying that because, as I've revealed, he is my least favorite president. I'm saying it because it's a fact. And I demonstrate that fact with this example. Wilson goes to Europe to the acclaim of the American people and to the acclaim of both the people of the Allied and Central Powers countries, because the people of the world see Woodrow Wilson as a man untainted by the power politics of the past. And Wilson cultivates this image. His 14 points, his notion of peace without victory, is a hope for the defeated nations of Central Europe and even for the people of the victorious nations. The idea of a man who's just a peacemaker, a disinterested peacemaker. That's Wilson. That's what he seems to be. So he's going to Europe to negotiate on behalf of the future, hopefully setting up a peaceful world. He doesn't bring a single Republican. The Republican Party controls the Senate. The Senate signs off on any treaty that the American government is involved with. At that time, the divide between Republicans and Democrats was there, but it wasn't as vitriolic as it is today. There were people in the Senate leadership who expected to be invited to go as part of the American delegation. The delegation was supposed to be from the United States, not from the Democratic Party. But Wilson didn't want to deal with political opposition within his own delegation. He had to negotiate with the British, the French, the Italians, and everyone else. He didn't want to have to negotiate with American Republicans. So he chose, it was his choice, not to include a single Republican member in the delegation to go to the Paris Peace Conference. So he goes to the Paris Peace Conference, and he negotiates for the national self-determination of peoples and for the establishment of a League of Nations and for a bunch of other things that we will talk about. And he doesn't have to deal with the people that irritate him the most on earth, conservatives. However, he has a treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, that he brings back to the United States in full hope and expectation, quite honestly, that the American government will sign off on the treaty and that the United States will be a leading member of the League of Nations. After all, we are the creditor nation of the world at that point. We loan people money. And we have enough economic power to have a military power second to none. With us involved, the League of Nations is going to have power, it's going to have money, it's going to have teeth. So Wilson sends it to the Senate and is genuinely dumbfounded when the Senate says no. It becomes very clear really quickly that Wilson's treaty is not going to pass the Republican Senate. Washington's admonition, George Washington, in his farewell address to the American people, warned against involving the United States in entangling European alliances. Avoid foreign entanglements is the exact words Washington uses. And up until this point, we got involved in the European War, but we didn't join the Allies formally. We were an associated power. We were very clear to make that, very careful to make that clear, that we were not engaging in a permanent alliance with the British and the French. We were going to make the world safe for democracy. We were associating ourselves with them. This is why it was so amazing that American troops allowed themselves to be placed under French command near the end of the war. So, in the name of avoiding foreign entanglements, most Republican senators, and again, Republicans control the Senate, are against this. So, Wilson, before calling a formal vote, goes on a national whistle-stop tour by train to speak directly to the people of the United States, to desperately plead with them, bless you, tissues over there if you need, to desperately plead with them to pressure their senators, Republican or Democrat, to sign this treaty, because Wilson thinks that this treaty is the key to the future of world peace. In the course of this incredible strain, he was a wartime president, then he went over to the Paris Peace Conference, and he had the hopes of the world riding on his shoulder. Then he comes back and he has to fight to pass this treaty with, to fight a political battle, when he's used to dealing with diplomacy, which is much grander. He has a stroke that makes him basically incapable of communicating with anyone. He's going to be bedridden for the next year or so, year and a half. Now, you have a president who has a stroke, who can't communicate with the world. He lies bedridden, and he can mumble a bit. That's about it. He is truly, truly messed up by the stroke. What do you think should happen?
Probably the vice president.
Yeah, that's what we would expect. We would expect that if the president is incapable because of something like a stroke or a heart attack or something else, if it's a heart attack, it might be temporary. So the vice president will step up to act as president, but there'll be no formal change of power. However, if it becomes clear that the president is permanently disabled, that's a different story. And at that point, but the amendment to the Constitution that formalizes that expectation isn't there yet. That's set up after World War II. So what happens is, even though you would expect the vice president to take over, Edith Wilson, in fact, becomes the acting president of the United States. The U.S. has had a female president in terms of the actuality of things. President Woodrow Wilson's wife, Edith, becomes the intercessor. Literally, cabinet officials, congressmen, the press will go to the antechamber in the White House, the room outside the president's bedroom, and they'll ask Edith a bunch of questions, and the secretary will write them down. And she'll say, okay, I'll talk to the president about it. And then she goes in. Sometimes she allows this to be seen. And Wilson's lying there, and she'll whisper in his ear, and he'll mumble into her ear. I mean, right into her ear. And they'll go back and forth for a few minutes, and then she'll come out and say what the president wants. You see the problem here? Nobody elected Edith Wilson to anything. In fact, during part of this time, women weren't even allowed to vote. But she acts as the president of the United States while her husband is infirm. Not just for a couple of weeks, not just even for a few months, but for about a year and a half, the last year and a half of Wilson's presidency. That's some serious stuff. However, the Treaty of Versailles fails. It does not pass the Senate. So, while the United States is certainly at peace, we are not going to become a part of the League of Nations. And without the League of Nations, including the United States, the League of Nations is crippled at its birth. It does not have a country capable of carrying the economic or the moral burden, honestly, or the military burdens that the League of Nations implies. The best they've got are the British and the French, who are both spent forces after the First World War.
Did no one have any problem with Edith being, acting as the president?
I think there were people who had problems. The reason it worked is because then as now, there is a preference on the part of most media outlets for progressive and Democrat politicians. And Wilson had been the most successful progressive politician in the country's history. He got the income tax passed. He established federal involvement in all sorts of economic matters. He helped set the stage to give women the right to vote and to make alcohol illegal, which were both progressive issues. Progressives were teetotalers; they were prohibitionists at that time. And I think that there was a general disrespect for Wilson's vice president. He was sort of thought of as a knob. So the press, for the most part, didn't make the giant issue of it that they might have. And without public outcry, and without precedent to guide, and without a constitutional amendment to guide, basically this was allowed to go on. Yeah. I beyond a certain point, I honestly don't understand it. I don't understand why Democrats or Republicans didn't insist on there being a...
Yeah, especially since that process, I feel like, was always pretty formal in terms of, like, vice presidents taking power and stuff like that. It's kind of shocking that...
It is.
Especially since the Senate was controlled by, like, Republicans, so you would think that, like...
Yeah, but they didn't push it.
Yeah, which is kind of...
Part of the reason, I think, is also we live in a country defined by atomic weapons. And during the Cold War, one of the reasons we had a constitutional amendment to formalize all of this is the fear is that the Russians would assassinate our president. They would decapitate our leadership, and that we would be mulling around figuring out who's president as their bombers came in and dropped H-bombs on us. So to prevent that, we take it much more for granted.
Yeah.
But that's why they hadn't gone through that yet. Yes, and then yes.
So after about a year of her acting as the sort of president, did Wilson ever step back in, or was it just too much?
His stroke permanently damaged him. I've had relatives and friends who've had strokes. And sometimes they're almost back to normal. I mean, they're never quite the same, but they're almost back to normal. They're able to function. Modern medicine's largely responsible for that. In Wilson's case, he got a little better, but it took him years. It was well after his presidency. And even then, he had difficulty communicating with the outside world.
Please. So then, did the power exchange? Like, was his term up?
Yeah, his term was up, and a new president, Warren Harding, was a disaster, and a Republican disaster. He was elected in 1920. So Edith basically just filled out the rest of his term. But again, there was always the pretense that she was going to the president and he was whispering in her ear. But gosh, that's so prone to corruption, to abuse. Yeah, and then back.
That's kind of surprising to me that after that, especially large time of tension, it was like after the largest war there had been in history, especially on the American side. Americans were ever involved.
Yeah.
That's a lot of... I'm surprised there wasn't more civil divide than there was. I mean...
Well, one of the things I'm going to talk about is the things everyone became afraid of. Communism is one of those things. There was a fear that the world was in uncharted territory. But throughout a lot of the 20th century, there was a principle between both parties that politics stopped at the water's edge. What that meant was that Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, would fight it out like cats and dogs about domestic policy. But to the greatest extent possible, both sides would create a common front international. Now that went up through the middle of towards the end of the Vietnam War. And then the Vietnam War changed, among other things, the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party's leadership had been willing to step up and intervene in wars overseas to stop communism. But Vietnam changed that. And the anti-war movement changed that. And so between 1968 and 1972, the Democratic Party goes from being a party that has led the Vietnam War to a party that opposes the Vietnam War. And from that point, there's been an increasing divide internationally. It's just things were a little different then. Mr. Rick.
Couldn't Woodrow Wilson's wife just like say whatever she wanted to say?
Yes, that's why.
That's the problem. What do you think, Mr. President? Oh, President is saying, yes, it's absolutely prone to abuse.
Yes.
And that's why I say she was the first de facto female president that we've ever had, because she made the decisions. Now, she always thought she knew her husband's mind. Like him, she was an active progressive. She was a suffragette. She was involved in political affairs. And so she had all of these instincts and all of this knowledge, and she just used it. But it was always in the name, in nomine presidentis, in the name of the president.
Did she ever sign anything like officially?
That's an interesting question. Somebody signed in the president's name. I don't know if it was her or if it was the secretary or whatever. But somebody would have to formally put the seal of the presidency on it. I think it might have been the president's formal secretary, who usually is empowered to do things like that. But it would be amazing. I'm not saying it's not impossible that she actually did in his name sometimes. But I think it was mostly a verbal thing.
I wonder if you could see an actual change in political policy from when he had the stroke and when she was feeding the press and the people the actual facts. Like, if you look at the first half of his term...
Yeah, by the time that she ended up there, it was the last year and a half of a two-term presidency. Usually when you have a two-term presidency, the first term is very active. Then the first year or two of the second term, things begin to slow down. The last couple of years are sort of caretaker. You've spent your energy, you've done what you're going to do, the people know you, they're used to you, they trust you, but you're basically holding your ground until the next election. And so what was unusual about this is in the last 2 years of his presidency, we've completed the war and helped establish the peace. So there was a lot to do, but a lot of it was international. I don't know if there was much of a change. She was a progressive like him, and so his domestic policies didn't. If anything, they might have slightly become more progressive, but I don't know. Beyond a certain point. Is that again?
In some ways, yeah. Sometimes I also found this interesting in the videos, and it's something, you know, if the divide between parties wasn't as bad as it is now right then, I feel like if he wanted or had the, you know, if he had enough resolve to be able to deal with his own struggles on U.S. soil, he could take Republicans, and then there's a chance the treaty might have been different, but it would have passed. It would have maybe.
I think so too, and there were many Republicans that were eager to work with him. I mean, whether or not they would have gone along with his League of Nations is unclear, but there were a lot of Republicans who basically were willing to give Wilson's ideas at least a serious hearing. The answer I'll give you is a very personal one, and it may be rooted in my personality, so take it for what it's worth. I believe that if you are a true believer in your own ideas, and this is just true for conservatives and liberals, it has to do with being an ardent believer that you are right, a sense of your own wisdom and your own rectitude, that you can deal with people who are from outside. I remember when I was in high school and college, there were a lot of friends of mine who were very liberal. And whenever something was brought up about the Soviet Union, which was the big bad enemy at the time, they would always seem to make excuses for it. Oh, the Russian people, they're backward, they have a brutal history, they're just afraid of us, they're just doing what they can in response to us. They would always find a way to turn the thing around and make it America's fault. And when the Cold War finally ended and the Berlin Wall fell, and the true face of Soviet communism was revealed in all of its grisly horror, many of them just shut up. They didn't talk about it anymore. They moved on to other topics. Because what they had done inadvertently, because I think they were very good people, in fact, I know they were good people, they were well-intentioned, is they had apologized for genuine evil. But they didn't. To them, outsiders were to be placated. The real opponents were the people standing in the way of paradise here at home. And I've seen this again and again. If you believe that you have utopia as your goal and a way to get there in your grasp, then the worst people on earth aren't necessarily the dictators in foreign lands. They're the people in your own country that oppose your ideas. Because those people are standing in the way of progress to utopia. So, yeah, there are monsters and wear funny uniforms and they make loud speeches overseas. But it's the other party and the other ideology that's standing in the way of us doing our dream of paradise. So, sometimes the greatest pettiness is reserved for, and the greatest intransigence is reserved for domestic political opponents, as opposed to international opponents. People can excuse Joe Stalin for being a brute without having a close view of what he's really doing, because he's not our problem. One of my friends did explain it to me, and what she said was, I can't change things overseas, but I'm an American, I can change things here. I want to make a better society here. So that's my focus. I don't really care about what goes on overseas, except in that it affects things that I want to do here at home. I don't know if any of that made sense to you. It's why I am desperately careful to try to encourage you to remember, you're not the smartest person in every room that you're in. Your ideas are not objectively good. And the people who disagree with them are neither stupid nor evil. There are good people with good intentions who can disagree with almost everything that you hold dear. If you fall into the trap of assuming that you have the only key to utopia, then your political opponents are either stupid or evil, and you cannot help but develop contempt for them. And it's that contempt that Wilson had that prevented him from bringing Republicans, that prevented the Treaty of Versailles from being accepted. And I do accept that America's lack of presence in the League of Nations was a contributing factor in World War II. Had we been involved, it may have been a very different League of Nations than it was. The world might have actually come together to stop aggression, to discourage it. But we'll never know because it didn't happen. Those were, I think, excellent questions. Thank you for asking. I hope that the conversation was useful. Instead, what happens is, without the United States and the League, the Europeans, the British and French, set up what's called the Little Entente, Le Petit Entente. And the Little Entente was about containing the communists behind a cordon sanitaire. A cordon sanitaire is a sanitary line. So you have Bolshevism in Russia, and you've got Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland, all as sort of frontline states against the Soviet Union. So what the French and British try to do is set up a new alliance system whereby all of these little countries, or as many of them as possible, are part of Le Petit Entente, the Little Entente, and that if the Soviets go after Poland or Czechoslovakia, or anyone goes after Poland or Czechoslovakia, that they'll be in a war with France, and maybe even Britain. And that will tend to discourage war, because if you want to attack Czechoslovakia, you'll probably win. Maybe not. But if you attack Czechoslovakia in alliance with Britain, France, and the other little nations of Central Europe, it's not so easy. So, actually, despite the existence of the League of Nations, old-style alliance politics are set up in the center of Europe to deter communist expansion. Now, the other thing that Wilson has to deal with is the other members of the Big Four. The Big Four are Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States; David Lloyd-George, Prime Minister of Britain; Georges Clemenceau, le Tigre, the Tiger, the Premier of France, the French Republic; and Vittorio Orlando. Orlando is the Prime Minister of Italy. And all of these different people have goals, just like Wilson does, and they're not going to be pushovers for him. Now, the British are an interesting case because the British actually had the right idea. The British, again and again, would instinctively go for making Versailles a generous peace. Like the Congress of Vienna, which didn't take territory from France. The Congress of Vienna didn't punish or humiliate France. Congress of Vienna assumed that the new French government was friendly to the other governments of the world. But because of all the death that happened, there's this great desire to punish the Germans, to punish the defeated powers. Whether the government is completely different from the Kaiser's government or not, they're Germans, they've got to pay. Can't trust them. But the British oppose this. The British say, in South Africa, when we fought the Boers, we gave them a generous peace. We made them partners. And they voluntarily joined us in World War I. We should not make an enemy of Germany. If we do, it'll haunt us. But despite this understanding, the war bankrupted the British Empire. Bankrupted it. By 1916 to 1917, the British Empire's economy should have collapsed, and it would have, except for American banking. American bankers bankrolled the last year and a half, 2 years of World War I for the Allies. Now, the British need to pay this money back to the American bankers. And where are they going to get the money? Well, in an election promise, Prime Minister Lloyd-George promises that the Germans will pay for the war. I mean, this has echoes of President Trump, or candidate Trump, saying that Mexico will pay for the wall. I never thought Mexico would pay for the wall. I didn't want Mexico to pay for the wall. But it was an election promise that appealed to a lot of people. Lloyd-George promised the Germans will pay for the war, when we win. So, now that they've won, Lloyd-George is caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, the British leadership and many of the British people want a generous peace because they don't want a permanent fracture with the Germans. They don't want to turn Germany into a perpetual enemy. But somebody's got to pay for the war. Well, how do you get the defeated power to pay for the war and still look good in a world of international law and League of Nations? You can't just go, you give me money because I beat you. That's too primitive. So a legal reason needs to be there for Germany to pay for the war. And Lloyd-George comes up with the answer. Germany has to admit in the Treaty of Versailles that they are guilty for causing the war. And if they're guilty for causing the war, and they've admitted they're guilty for causing the war, then of course they have to pay for the war. It's like admitting, yeah, I was cutting a tree down in my yard and it crushed your house. My fault. I'll pay for it. And if I don't want to pay for it, I'm going to be made to pay for it. You know, if it's not, I'm not talking wind, I'm talking I was cutting down a tree and I was just negligent and it ended up smashing your house. That's my fault. I am at fault. I have a legal and moral responsibility to atone for that, and that means I am going to pay for it. So, Germany, per Lloyd-George's election promise, Germany has to agree that they're guilty for the war in order for Lloyd-George to put the screws to them to get them to pay for the war. So, what do you think dominates? The desire for a generous peace or the desire to get the Germans to foot the bill? Lloyd-George insists, against the better judgment of a lot of people, that Germany must pay for the war and therefore Germany must admit guilt for the war. Now look, this is going to violate a great modern thing, but there are bases in reality for most legends. And this includes stereotypes. So, are Italian men emotional and do we talk with our hands? Yes! Okay? Are Frenchmen great romantics? Yes, they are. In general, I mean, there are exceptions. But in general terms, the French are romantics and the Italians are emotional. The Germans are scrupulous. The modern German people, as a national group, are scrupulous. Look, the Germans have, thanks to Hitler, a set of highways called the Autobahn. The Autobahn have no speed limits between cities. Traditionally, they had no speed limits at all. So you get a German in a Mercedes or a Porsche going down the road at 150, 160, 180 miles an hour, and it's perfectly legal as long as they're in control of the car. German cars do not have cup holders because driving is not something that you do casually. It's something, because at 150 miles an hour, you do anything wrong and you're flat. You're splat on the road somewhere. Now, if a German politician came along and said, we're going to have a 30 mile an hour, a 30 kilometer an hour, 20 mile an hour speed limit on the Autobahn, you know what the German people would do? They'd start driving at 30 kilometers an hour, 20 miles an hour. And they'd vote that politician out at the first opportunity. Now, if an American politician did that, what would we do? We'd completely ignore them. In fact, we go faster, just to spite them. Yeah, fine, give me a speeding ticket. I can't drive 55. I lived through this, actually. There was a federal speed limit of 55 miles an hour, and a lot of people didn't. They resented it. But the Germans would obey it. And then they'd vote out the person. Why? Because they're scrupulously lawful. Yeah.
When my mom and sister were in Germany, they said that in general, Germans are...
They have to be. But also, Germany has far fewer roads per mile by mile than the United States. So the Autobahn is a much thicker roadbed. It's a much more stable surface. But yeah, they have to be. You can be sloppy at 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. You cannot be sloppy at over 100 miles an hour. I know, because I've been an aggressive driver in my youth, and I will go where I have gone fast. And there's no room for mistakes. There's no room for distraction. Right.
I just realized this because you're saying it. My car is German, and the only cup holders are like built off the side. Like they're not actually they're like built off the side.
That's for American customers. It is. No, they themselves, they're actually kind of proud of this. I talked to a couple of Germans. Why would you have cup holders? You have driving. Driving is a full-time job. And they're, for them, it's right. What I'm saying is the German people are punctilious about being correct about things. All has to be in order. This is true for a German housewife or a German politician. I used to work with a guy, a great and influential man in my life, who had to flee Chile because of the dictatorship of Pinochet. And he was a German Chilean. And we worked security. That's what I did to pay through my way through college. And he was always thinking, Rolf, you must write between the lines. You are sloppy. Your lines, they cross the line. No, right between the lines. And he wasn't mean. It was just his way of expressing himself. Germans tend to be like that. So you're asking the German people to accept guilt so that the British can charge them money. To accept guilt for a war that's not their fault. It's the Serbians' fault. It's the Austrians' fault. It's Konrad von Hotzendorf's fault for insisting that the Serbians accept Austrian troops on their side. It's the Russians' fault for saying to Serbia, don't worry, little Slavic brethren, we have your back. You idiots! You set the thing up. The Germans are maybe a fifth or sixth cause of the First World War. But because they have no power at this point, their armies have disbanded, their country is rife with revolution, the treaty powers at Versailles are able to extort from the German government a war guilt clause. And the war guilt clause cuts across all political lines. Except for the Communist Party of Germany, everyone else, including socialists, hate this. Because what Germans are having to admit is 2 + 2 = 5. For a nation of absolutely scrupulous, law-abiding people, I mean, what made Hitler so successful is he ordered genocide in a lawful fashion, so the Germans go along with it. That's important. It wouldn't work in Italy the same way. It didn't. And it wouldn't work in France or in Russia or in Britain. Every nation has a particular archetypical character. The Germans, because they're forced to admit by the Versailles Treaty that they are guilty for a war that they are not guilty for, it creates a knot of anger that will not be assuaged. a knot of anger that will not be denied. And it's that knot of anger, as much as anything else, that turns Hitler from being a fringe politician to being a chancellor that is elected and reelected by increasing majorities, that makes him a popular politician for almost everyone in Germany. Because he is going to avenge the shame of Versailles. And the shame of Versailles isn't just the lost territory, which I'll talk more about, it's the war guilt clause. War guilt clause, more than anything else, was a preventable mistake. It is worse than Wilson not bringing any Republicans with him.
That's really interesting to me because I think that when like considering World War II and thinking about like how Hitler had control over his like country in a lot of ways, I always was kind of like, but how? Because it seems so crazy looking from like an outside point of view, and so it's really interesting thinking about how it's like connected to the Treaty of Versailles and everything else.
Irrationalism, willful irrationalism, a craving for irrationality, oddly enough, is a part of National Socialism, of fascism, even of that period's communism. The idea that we're defying reason because we're doing what feels right. And when you mess with a country's emotional center, like the war guilt clause does with Germany, again, this is worse than the loss of Polish territory or territory to Poland. This goes to the heart of who a person is. Are we going to admit to a falsehood because we are forced to? I don't want to use the term rape because it's not a rape, but it feels a bit like one to the German people. They were forced to accept something against their will that goes against their very nature. And it's going to have to happen. Thank you all. Have a great day, and God willing, see you tomorrow.